All right, everybody at home, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes, sir.
Okay, thanks. Oops. Well, welcome to Monday. This would kind of normally be fall break, but thanks to Hurricane Ida, no. So we're making it up gradually. And today we're going to switch gears. We've finished talking about populations for this course. We've laid the groundwork for now talking about interactions among populations. And we're going to use some of the models that we have developed over the last couple of weeks to understand how populations interact. Now, this is going to be heavily graphical. So you're going to want to pay close attention to the graphs that we show over the next couple of weeks and try your best to understand them. For competition in particular, there is also a mathematical component to it because we're simply going to modify the logistic growth equation to account for competition. So you'll have to understand how that modification works and identify the pieces of it and how we get them. But for today, we're simply going to look at one of the major kinds of species interactions in nature, which is competition, and try to understand what it is that happens in nature and what our models should be able to analyze. So we'll look at patterns in nature. We'll look at what we call ecological segregation and explain what that has to do with competition. And we'll then turn our attention to the overlap in niches and how that can produce what we call competitive exclusion, that is, one species causing the extinction of another, or possibly allow two species to coexist. We'll give you an example of competitive exclusion from Paramecium, and then really importantly, we'll talk about the idea that competition can be very unequal, and we'll give you an example from nature that illustrates that. So really, we distinguish four main species interactions in nature. Competition is the first, and that's our subject for the next week. Exploitation in all its varied forms, including predation, parasitism, and parasitoids, is a second one. Mutualism is a third, and the fourth is commensalism. Now, let me just deal with commensalism right now today, because commensals are organisms that benefit from an association with another species, but have a neutral effect on their partner. So this is actually very, very rare in nature, and we're really not going to deal with it in this course. Commensals are like probably the best example, the one that people relate to most easily is Remoras. Remoras are little fish that attach themselves to the underside of a shark's jaw. They don't hurt the shark. They don't help the shark. So their effect on the shark is neutral. But being able for them to associate with a shark is positive for the remora because sharks are sloppy eaters and they get to eat little bits of food that the shark tears apart but can't swallow. So the remora gains a benefit. The shark is unaffected. And we try to couch these costs and benefits that we might have in these species interactions in terms of the carrying capacity. That is particularly true for competition and for predation or exploitation. We do have, in fact, quantitative models that are kind of based on carrying capacity for those things. It's going to be really obvious for competition, be a little less obvious for exploitation. Mutualism, not so much. But just very briefly, the other three interactions have varying effects on the carrying capacities of the interacting species. Competition is an interaction in which each species is negatively affected by the presence of the other. So the carrying capacity is reduced for both species. In exploitation, one species benefits, so its carrying capacity increases, the other species is harmed and its carrying capacity decreases. And in mutualism, the carrying capacity of both interacting species is increased by the presence of the other. They gain a benefit, a mutual benefit. So today we'll start with competition, which is the mutually detrimental interaction between species. So what patterns in competition do we see in nature? Well, okay, so we often see similar species that do not occupy the same niche or the same habitat, because we're not actually looking at the niche. The niche, remember, is the abstract list of requirements and tolerances. But in many cases in nature, we see similar species occupying different areas, say, of a moisture gradient. One of them on the wetter side, one of them on the drier side. This is very, very common. And in many cases, this is suggestive of niche overlap and competition. So we try to visualize competition in the following way. We consider what degree of niche overlap might two species share in a particular community. If they share most of their niche, then it would be very hard for them to coexist because they're competing for virtually the same things. So here on the left, we have an example of high niche overlap. And on the x-axis, we just have a resource axis, just any old abstract axis. And on the y-axis, we have the frequency with which two different species use these resources, whatever they are. It could be prey size, it could be salinity gradient from freshwater to saltwater. But in this case, look at the broad area of overlap in which they're competing. All right, so each species has only a very limited range of resources that they have all to themselves. And that means they face extra competition for the other set of resources. And what's particularly interesting is look at what these species like the best. Right there, the right-hand species likes this range of resources the best, and look, it has to compete with another species for the things it likes the best. Same is true over here for the species on the left. Its preferred resources are unfortunately shared with this other species. Okay. So the more these niches overlap, the more likely it is that competition will force one of these species extinct. And any little advantage that one of the species has over the other, maybe the faster reproductive rate, maybe the ability to monopolize resources, any little advantage like that will cause one species to drive the other extinct. Okay, what we often see in nature, though, is a situation where there's this low niche overlap, where, say, two species occupy different areas of a moisture gradient, or a salinity gradient, or use different sized prey. Well, there may be some limited overlap in their niches then, but at least here, each species has their favorite resources all to themselves. And they're not competing with this other species for those resources. So coexistence is much more likely when you have low niche overlap than when you have high niche overlap. Basically, these species are competing not only with others of their species for these favored resources, they're competing with a whole other species. So that extra competition reduces the energy that each individual gets. It reduces their ability to reproduce. It may reduce their ability to survive. So the higher the degree of niche overlap, the less likely coexistence is. The more likely one species will exclude another through competition, or as we say, competitive exclusion will occur. So here's the thing then, this high niche overlap is inherently unstable. If you're going to have intense competition and one species is going to drive another to extinction, how often are you ever going to see that? Mostly you're going to see the end product of this kind of thing. You're going to see that one species is living in an area and another species is absent. Well, hey, that's very like this low overlap situation where they're occupying different ends of a moisture or salinity gradient. We don't see high competition due to high niche overlap very frequently in nature because it's inherently unstable and it doesn't last very long. So the question has been for many decades, well, how important is competition really? If we don't see competition, how can we know what's going on here is the result of competition, or maybe it's just the result of they just had different niches for, so this has been an argument that ecologists have had for a long time. Now, the punchline is that we now believe that competition is very pervasive, and just because we don't see it very often in terms of high niche overlap, doesn't mean that it's not important. We believe that many of these situations in which we see low niche overlap can be traced back to the results of competition in the past. So that's the punchline. That's why we're spending time on competition in this course. We do think it's important. And we have some empirical evidence that does suggest it. So what do we see in nature? We don't actually see competition due to high niche overlap very often. We frequently see this low niche overlap. And so we want to explore the conditions under which competition might be important. So what we saw on the previous slide is a one resource axis. They're competing for one resource axis. And here then is a diagram of the two-dimensional niche with two different resources. And so you have two species here that are competing for these two resources. And notice that each of them is kind of a bullseye in their niche. They have an outer envelope that inside of which the species can grow. The the population can grow, outside of which the population declines to extinction. And they have these increasingly more favorable combinations of the resources. And here's the sweet spot for this species right here. And notice that the sweet spot for the other species is a little bit different. Well, so it would appear likely that these two species could coexist. There's not an overlap of these most favored combinations of resources. However, notice something really interesting about this. The two species have different patterns of overlap. If you consider the species on the lower right here, notice that its bullseye lies outside the types of resources that the other species use altogether. So there is no overlap between what this species likes and what this species might potentially use. On the other hand, this species here on the upper left has its most favored resources, its optimal combination of resources, also being used by the species at the lower right. Well, in that case, here's a reason to think that competition might be unequal. It is quite possible that the optimal resources of this species on the lower right not being affected by the other one give it somewhat of an advantage. And this species on the upper left would have, we would guess, less of an effect on the carrying capacity of the one on the lower right than the one on the lower right does on one on the upper left. This species might have a greater effect on the carrying capacity of this one because of the pattern of overlap. So it's important to understand there's a logical reason why we might not expect competition to be equal among species, other than the fact that very different kinds of species can also compete. For instance, horses and grasshoppers both eat grass. Well, okay, they should have relatively different effects on one another, but even very similar species might not have equal effects on one another. There might be significantly different kinds of effects on the carrying capacity of each species. So let's look at a little more detail at what we typically find in nature then. So what we typically find in nature is patterns like this. And I've been talking about like occupying two ends of a moisture gradient, occupying two ends of a salinity gradient. This is actually the very first study in ecology that noted that species that are very similar and ought to have pretty similar niches don't overlap in their use of habitats. So this is a study from the doctoral dissertation of Robert MacArthur, who is one of the most influential ecologists in the history of ecology. This was his dissertation in the forests of New England, and it was on 5 species of warblers, because he was a bird watcher, basically. And he looked at where these 5 species, which are so similar that they are indistinguishable to people who don't practice, where they feed in the trees, in the pine trees of New Hampshire. Okay, and so what you see here, the yellow shading indicates where these species are spending their time feeding. So on the left here is the percentage of total observations that they spend feeding in these areas. And the yellow shaded portions of this sort of cartoon tree indicate the areas where they're feeding. And on the right, here's the total percentage of the total number of observations. Okay, so this is time spent. This is total observations. Time is probably the better thing to look at, and we'll focus on the left-hand side of these trees. Okay, so we can see that for the Myrtle Warbler up here, it spends most of its time below the canopy, sort of on the ground or on the very lowest branches. And it can spend a bit of its time sort of on the middle branches, the middle of the middle branches. Well, look, that's completely different almost from the black-throated green warbler. It does use the middle of these middle branches, but look, it also uses these outside branches on the upper part of the tree. And that is completely non-overlapping with the Myrtle Warbler. That looks very much like what we saw right here. Each species has its a portion of its niche that is not shared with another species. If we look at the Blackburnian warbler, notice that it's sharing these upper branches, but the top of the tree is all to itself. It does not share that. Okay, here is the bay-breasted warbler, and notice here it's using these sort of lower, middle, inner parts of the branches, which are not used by any of the other warblers, even though it's overlapping sort of here with both the black-throated and Blackburnian, and here with the myrtle and black-throated green. It's got these inner branches all to itself. So in each case, there is niche overlap, but it's not complete. And finally, here you have the Cape May warbler, and it's overlapping with the Blackburnian warbler, but we don't know why. Anyway, this suggests that competition may be currently operating, or it may suggest that species just have different niches. Now, just because they have different niches doesn't mean that competition wasn't important in the past. But for right now, how do we know whether, say, the Cape May warbler here might use these lower branches here if we took away the Blackburnian warbler? Maybe this is actually a part of its niche, and it's being excluded from that by the Blackburnian warbler. How do we know that this Myrtle Warbler here would not move up higher in the tree if the bay-breasted warbler was not there to occupy that? So what we're asking is, are these patterns due to the species having different niche requirements, or are they due to one species excluding another from a part of its niche? Remember, we have a fundamental niche, which is all of the conditions that a species can use. And then we have the realized niche, which is what it can do in a given community. So in a given community, a species may be excluded from part of its fundamental niche by another species. But if you remove that competitor, it might then expand what it's doing. So I think you can see logically that, hey, there's a way to test this. If we could remove one species, we could see what the other species do. If they respond to the removal of their competitor by expanding their use of the habitat, then it's pretty clear. They were excluded by current competition with that other species. On the other hand, if we take the competitor away, the potential competitor, because we don't know that it is, if we take that potential competitor away and the target species doesn't do anything, it sticks to what it's been doing, it doesn't respond at all, then that's just its niche. It wasn't excluded from those areas by the other species at all. That's not part of its niche. Okay, so there's an inherent ambiguity in what we see in nature because we don't know why we're seeing what we're seeing. It could be that each species is excluding the others from a portion of their niche. Or it could be that their niches are just different anyway. So when we see this pattern where different species are occupying different areas of habitat, we call it ecological segregation. Okay, we do not call this competition because we don't know that that's what's producing it. It's ecological segregation. We would have to do removal experiments to determine if this is due to competition or if they just have different niches. Now, back in the 1800s and early 1900s, people would actually go out with shotguns and kill a bunch of animals to see what the effect was on the remaining animals. Well, we don't do that anymore. But that's the kind of experiment that we're talking about here. We're actually removing a competitive species. Today, we can still get that same effect. We can use nets, for instance, to close off an entire tree or an entire area of forest. And of course, this is very expensive, but so we don't do this a lot. But Bob Marquis at the University of Missouri St. Louis has done these experiments. He's taken these giant nets and enclosed a number of trees under these nets and removed some of the birds and put others in and asked, do they expand their range? Do they not? Do they just do the same thing? So he's trying to distinguish in these experiments between differences in niches versus competitive exclusion. And he finds some of each. The point is that we can do these kinds of experiments to determine what the source of ecological segregation is. It may or may not be competition. And so you need to be very clear. This pattern in nature suggests, but does not show competition. It is ecological segregation, but its origin is not known until you do an experiment. Okay, so here's an experimental test of competition in Paramecium. Okay, you'll remember that George Gauss did experiments on population growth in microorganisms. And here he's doing a competition experiment with the same system. So here he's growing two species of Paramecium in very similar conditions. And when you grow them separately, Aurelia here is in the blue and Caudatum is in the red. They both reach their carrying capacities under these very similar situations. So when only competition among each member, only among members of each species is going on, they reach their carrying capacities. Excuse me. All right, but what happens when you put them in competition? So when you put them in the same experimental setup, what happens? Well, as it turns out, Paramecium aurelia, here in the blue, causes the extinction of Paramecium caudatum. It does it pretty quickly. Like in 2 weeks, you've got near extinction of caudatum. Well, this is an experimental demonstration of competitive exclusion. The niches of these two Paramecium are so similar that they cannot coexist. And Aurelia has a small advantage over Caudatum. I think in this case, it's the reproductive rate. And any small advantage in this situation will cause one species to competitively exclude the other. So here's an experimental demonstration of competitive exclusion. So when we model the interaction of competition, we need to be able to have models that produce extinction. One species has to be able to drive another extinct. But we also have to have the opportunity for two species to coexist. So keep that in mind as we develop our models on Wednesday. But in this case, we see a very clear competitive exclusion here. Now, there can also be other kinds of interactions that are a little harder to tease apart. And this is an illustration of a natural experiment that was done on the coast of Washington State in the Rocky Intertidal. And what we observed was that there are two types of mussels on this shore. And let me see here. Can we move this? Well, yeah, let's move it down for a moment. Let's see. Can we move it down? Let's move it down, yeah. Because I want to show you this. Okay, so here is the lowest area of the intertidal zone, and this is the area that's covered by waves nearly always. And up here is the splash zone that's almost never covered by waves, but only gets those splashes from the waves at the highest tides. So this is intertidal. This is the highest of the high tides. This is the lowest of the low tides. Down here, these organisms are uncovered very infrequently. Up here, they're covered by water very infrequently. And in between, they get covered by water twice a day, and they get exposed to the air twice a day. The higher up you are, the longer you're exposed to the air. The lower down, the longer you're covered by water. So the pattern that we noticed here was that there were two mussel species. And the first one is Thamellus, and that's C-H-T-H-A-M, Thamellus. And the other is Balanus. Okay, so Thamellus occurs up here in the high intertidal. Balanus occurs down here in the low intertidal. All right, that pattern is not competition. It is ecological segregation. But we have an opportunity to ask what produces this pattern. Is it competition, or do the two species have different niches? So this is one of the most influential experiments in ecology, partly because its results were so clear, and partly because it showed people that you can do experimental ecology without actually killing a bunch of animals, although basically this guy did. So what we want to know then is why Thamellus is in the upper intertidal and why Balanus is in the lower intertidal. Balanus is in the area where it gets covered by water a lot. Thamellus is in the upper intertidal where it's covered infrequently. So is Thamellus just more tolerant of being dry? Is Balanus adapted better to being covered by water and can't exist up here? Maybe Thamellus is stressed when it's covered by seawater too often. That would be the argument that the niches are different for these two species. Or maybe Thamellus prevents Balanus from colonizing this upper area, and Balanus prevents Thamellus from colonizing the lower area. That would be the competition argument. So at this point, we have ecological segregation, but we don't know why. We have to do this experiment. We have to do the equivalent of going out with a shotgun and shooting all the birds. Okay, well, in this case, what we can do is sort of chisel off some Thamellus in the high intertidal and produce bare rock. And we can ask, well, hey, who colonizes that? And we can do the same down here in the lower intertidal under the water and ask, well, which species colonizes that? If they both colonize both areas, but only Thamylus survives up here and only Balanus survives down here, then we could potentially separate the effect of niche versus competition. If they're both capable of colonizing there, but only one survives, that sounds like competition. However, if Balanus really can't survive up here and Thamylus can't survive down here, that sounds like the niches are different. So what we then do is do this experiment. Oops, and why am I not able to forward here? Go this way. There we go. Okay, so this is a summary then of what we found when we did that experiment. Okay, and I'm going to put this back up here now so that we can see a little bit of the caption. All right, so the person who did this was Joseph Connell, and this was his doctoral dissertation at the University of Washington. Joe Connell is still at the University of California, Santa Barbara, still working on intertidal ecology. He's still got PhD students. He's a better man than I because he's a lot older than I am. But here's what he found. And we will hear that name again, by the way, later in the course. So the black bars here show you where Balanus is able to colonize, right? So Balanus can colonize areas kind of above the area where the adults occur, but mostly the larvae are found only in the area where adults occur. Okay, in contrast, Thamylus larvae can colonize way, way down into the lower intertidal. So they can live there, but the adults only survive in the upper intertidal. Okay, so the patterns are different. Balanus basically colonizes the area that it can tolerate. It colonizes the area that represents its niche. Thamylus can colonize the area that represents its niche, but it is clearly excluded from some of that area by competition from Balanus. Balanus has a strong effect on the distribution of Thamylus. Thamylus has almost no impact on Balanus because Balanus cannot live in the upper intertidal. It is limited by moisture, not by competition from Thamylus. Thamylus, on the other hand, can live way down in the lower intertidal if you remove Balanus. But if you don't remove Balanus, Balanus outcompetes and kills Thamylus. So we have Balanus excluding Thamylus from the lower intertidal. That's current competition. But we also have Balanus not being able to colonize the upper intertidal. And the presence of Thamylus has nothing to do with that. They don't care whether Thamylus is there or not. They can't survive there. That's the niche. So these two species are regulated by two different things. Thamylus is strongly affected by competition from Balanus. The distribution of Balanus has virtually no relationship to that of Thamylus. It's based on its niche requirements. So we have very, very unequal impacts of competition on these two species. Thamylus is harmed by strong competition from Balanus down here in the lower intertidal. Balanus has the ability to grow pretty much where it grows, and there is virtually no effect of competition from Thamylus. Even though they are very, very similar species, the competition between them is very unequal. Thamellus is much more strongly affected by competition from Balanus. Balanus is almost completely unaffected by competition from Thamellus. So how do we know this? Well, let's find out. There we go. So here is how we know this. Okay, we know that Balanus cannot survive in the upper intertidal. So if you remove Thamellus, it doesn't matter. Balanus can't live in that area anyway, and they don't even colonize the area. On the other hand, Thamellus can colonize the lower intertidal. Now, if you just allow the two species to work their interaction out, this is what you see. You see the open circles here. The percent or the number of Thamellus in an experimental plot drops drastically and eventually goes to extinction. So Thamellus can colonize those areas, but if you allow Balanus to compete with it, they die out. If you remove Balanus, so if you go in there and continue to chisel away these competing mussels over, say, a year or so, and prevent Balanus from coming into those areas, Thamellus is perfectly happy right there. Its survivorship is really good. And they form dense patches in the lower intertidal. So clearly what's happening here is that Balanus is outcompeting Thamellus in the lower intertidal. We've just proved it with this experiment. If you remove Balanus, Thamellus is fine. If you allow both of them to inhabit the same area, Balanus drives Thamellus extinct. We even know the mechanism, which is that Balanus kind of grows low on the surface of the rock, whereas Thamellus grows a little bit up. And basically Balanus can just grow underneath Thamellus and just sort of lever it off, just sort of pop it right off as it grows. So we know then a number of things about competition in nature. We know that one species can drive another extinct. We know that two species can coexist. We know that competition can be inherently very, very unequal, even among very similar species. So these are the things that we want to be able to incorporate into predictive models that we might be able to use in managing real populations in real time. And when we start to develop those models on Wednesday, that's the outcome we want to see. We want to have models that allow us to predict competitive exclusion and the extinction of one species or coexistence. So that is a relatively brief introduction to competition in nature. And that's all we have for today. Comment on the laboratory. The plants that were planted on Wednesday, the little radish and wheat seeds, they're busting out already. So they're looking really good. The ones that were planted on Friday, they will need a little more time to show up. We lost some water from the competition, from the population growth cups, but I added it and things are looking, yeah, pretty good. So we'll see what they look like in 2 weeks. And I've started grading the exams, but there are people who are displaced and won't be able to finish that exam until a little bit later this week. So don't look for the result until about Friday, okay? So unless we have questions, either here in class or at home, you are free to go. Okay, guys at home, make sure that you type in the chat box before I close it out. Well, that's what we're going to talk about Friday. And what we'll do is explain how and why that happens. So we're not just going to say that, but we're going to walk you through it. Show you some examples.